When supply sleds crested the ridge in March 1862, the valley looked folded in on itself, an expanse of snow chimneys black, no footprints. The men driving the horses expected dogs and voices and the clatter of ordinary life. Instead, they were met by a silence that pressed against their lungs. No smoke rose from any flue. No lanterns swung on porches. No one called across fences. In the mayor's parlor, they found him propped upright on the bed, hands folded, eyes closed, his face uncannily calm as if in prayer. It was not panic, not convulsion, not fever. It was the stillness of someone who had chosen to stop breathing without struggle. They moved house to house, and the tableau repeated. Families lying peaceful, a baby cradled, 43 souls without wound. Every clock in town had frozen at the same minute, 3:17 a.m., as if time itself had inhaled and refused to exhale. Between pages and pockets, folded beneath collars and tucked into hymnals, they left small squares of parchment with single lines written like answers, not suicide notes. One child wrote, "She told me stories in my sleep." Another wrote, "The hush is enough." A third simply noted, "The moment has softened." In the chapel, the bell's clapper had been removed and laid upon the altar beside a cloth embroidered with a single German word, Jinnug, enough. It was not a random act of vandalism, but a deliberate sealing, a silence enacted from within by hands who understood closure. They called themselves the Keepers of Still Water, a congregation older than town gossip, who practiced togetherness as a kind of sacred quiet. Their doctrine described a veil hour before dawn, when the self thinned, when many could merge into one sustained rest through ritualized settling. Dream logs from autumn into winter recorded the same image: a woman in a doorway, a town lying down beneath a canvas sky, the bell heard from underwater. One small note asked, "Who is she who sings between the hours?" And that singular pronoun would unmoor the walls of explanation for me. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And if this voice reaches you, subscribe and tell me where you sit, your town, your county. Take this not simply as history, but as an invitation. Once you know, clocks rearrange themselves in your head and the quiet begins to have shape. Remember this hour when silence chooses us. I stayed in Howlbrook, what maps later crossed out, because to understand such silence you must sleep where it was born. And so I took Reverend Moses' cot beneath layers of wool and old sermon notes. My first nights were all itch of nerves and small sounds, until on the fifth night everything stopped: wind, creak, even the distant shifting of frozen pines, and in their place a low, steady murmur like breath trapped under boards. It was not language at first, just cadence, a round and returning pressure that pressed at the inside of my skull and made the hairs along my neck lift. I sat very still and the sound formed into rhythm, and later I would sketch a spiral in my notebook, 17 loops around a small hollow, without remembering beginning the line. At dawn I found pages of community journals in a cedar chest in the archive room, each labeled, numbered, and filled with dream entries that converged on the same image. They had named the practice settling, and they had scheduled it as one might schedule a market or a sermon, precise times written in a ledger under the title order of settling. When I unfolded the ledger, the handwriting was meticulous, names and half-hour marks running like a song: Joseph G. Walden, 1:30 a.m., Mary K. Fenn, 200, and so on until the final entry, 3:17 a.m. It was not rumor or fevered fiction. It was a plan, a choreography of rest designed to carry every soul in the town through a single articulated passage. I read the doctrine found in Reverend Moses' desk, Stillwater Doctrine, compiled 1857, updated 1861, and the words chilled me because they were careful, ritualized, procedural. They taught breath work in groups of 17, removal of mechanical noise including clocks and bells, the soft exclusion of spoken names in the week prior, time kept like liturgy. The doctrine described a veil hour, a slender window before dawn when defenses lowered, and a convergence. What they called unity could occur without violent rupture. There were meditations on silence, instructions for dimming the self so the greater pattern could pass through, written not as metaphor, but as field notes and practice. More unnerving was the brief paragraph titled, "For the one who remains awake, there must be an anchor." It said, a witness kept out of the drift so unity could be testified to. That paragraph felt like a caveat and a promise, a way to mollify conscience. One who watches so that history is not entirely swallowed by the settling. In Lorna Haynes's journal, I found a child's voice and then a map of resistances she had written, of waking with her mouth open, of a woman standing in snow, faceless and patient. Lena Thorne's note was different, her handwriting blurred at the edges as if rubbed. She had scratched at fabric and left words that ended mid. Thought she told me stories in my sleep. When I examined Lena's body, I found dirt beneath her nails and a tension in her hands, as if she had tried, however briefly, to hold back an inevitability. It meant not everyone had gone willingly. Cracks existed in the stillness, and those cracks made a terrible promise about what happened when a collective will carries the weight of one who resists. Remember, keep watch, keep witness. What I found tucked inside the false bottom of Reverend Moser's desk was not a sermon, but a manual, pages bound and titled Stillwater Doctrine, the handwriting steady, almost doctrinaire. Updated in 1861, it read like field notes for a program of interior collapse, methods for removing the self as though it were a garment to be shed for something larger. It spoke plainly about sound removal, silence as architecture, bell ropes to be unhooked, clocks to be wound down and set aside, names to be left unspoken for days. There were sections on shared breathing, groups of 17 breathing together on the exhale, reciting a single word, return, until the chant dulled the edges of singular will. A whole passage explained the veil hour, a sliver of time just before dawn when the body's defenses lie lowest and the mind is most porous to collective movement. It instructed on light deprivation for 3 days, avoidance of sunlight and loud work, the removal of mechanical noise so the inner cadence could be heard more clearly. Behind the clinical language lay metaphors that tasted like prayer. The self must dim to awaken to unity. Sleep is not retreat but passage into a mutual field. Yet even in its devotion the doctrine included contingency, the one who remains awake, a witness who would not cross, a role described in a paragraph both brief and urgent. I felt those words like a responsibility placed upon the shoulders of anyone who might later read the pages and refuse the kindness of sleep. My hand trembled as I read how they had scheduled each name, how the order of settling permitted no overlap, a precise choreography where each body lay down in sequence. The spiral I had drawn appeared again in marginalia, 17 loops, a center point, then outward arcs like concentric thresholds. The drawing was repeated in 3 different journals. Someone had practiced pattern making. Pattern was part of the work, a way to orient the mind toward the seam between waking and whatever lay beyond. On the 5th night, after reading these pages, I dreamed a woman standing in the schoolhouse doorway. She did not speak, but her presence felt like an instruction. She said nothing, yet when I woke the words reverberated in my mind, "You're late," an accusation and a summons that would return across other nights. Outside, the snow hid the world but revealed footprints leading away from Reverend Moser's hearth and disappearing toward the tree line. They were not recent, but they existed. I followed them once and found where the snow had been tamped into a ring of small stones and stick crosses. In the center lay a scrap of cloth embroidered in a Germanic hand with a word, "Enough." I kept notes and swore to be the lone witness. The deeper I dug into parish records and immigrant lists, the more Holbrook's past unfurled into something older and foreign, threads pulled through time from a valley in the old country. Families who arrived decades before kept names and phrases that meant little to neighbors. Corinthian lullabies, a private calendar of hushed Sabbaths and rituals that bent around silence. An old map showed the town's founding families clustered like a hand, their parcels abutting the long pines where children were told not to wander after dusk. In the library I found a yellowing letter from a woman named Laura, dated 1832, that spoke in half lines about a woman who stood in thresholds and taught the town how to quiet itself. It read like a manual of kindness and of power. "Give the hush its own altar," she wrote, "and the hush will keep you from sharp grief." Those lines moved from quaint to sinister when I realized the language had been formalized and ritualized. Kindness had become method, method had become machinery. My reading revealed something uglier: community structures. Elders, the schoolmaster, the reverend, had systematically woven doctrine into the day like thread into cloth. There were minutes of meetings where they discussed timing and cadence, who would lead breath work, how to remove clocks discreetly without alarm, how to teach children to accept the hush. They argued about consent in private notes, laying out pathways for persuasion that used stories, lullabies, and staged dreams to soften resistance over months and years. Halbrook's silence was not merely pious, it had been engineered by human hands who knew how to sculpt interior life for a final outcome. As I read these pages, I felt the presence of an institutional mind, a bureaucracy of belief that converted sorrow into a plan for mutual departure. The question shifted. Was this mass stillness an act of communal mercy, as the keepers claimed, or a slow, organized disappearance, shaped by those in authority for reasons not yet clear? If you are still caught by this voice, type "The veil is broken" twice below to bind what you now know to yourself. These rites ask for witnesses as much as they demand silence. I do not ask lightly. The act of naming it aloud in the comments will knot your attention to this story, and that knot will not easily be undone. Neighbors 3 miles distant reported oddities: cattle standing as if listening, wind that ceased at certain hours, children waking with the same phrase on their lips. Those reports suggested influence beyond Halbrook's fences, as if whatever practice had been honed in their meeting rooms exhaled into the surrounding land. I visited the field where Grayson said his cattle would not graze and found rounds of flattened grass like sleeping bodies bent toward the north. A merchant's ledger contained a note: 2 small bottles acquired for settling exercises. No names, no explanation, and later, pages missing where the entry should have been expanded. I began to see an administrative apparatus beneath the hymnal's procurement, training, instruction, and a timetable that read like municipal planning rather than religious counsel. Keep your eyes open, they will return. Once I accepted that Halbrook's quiet was organized, the next question was method. How do you teach a town to lay down and not struggle? The doctrine offered practical steps that read like an engineer's blueprint for the interior life: progressive light deprivation, staged dream sessions, and ritualized lullabies that doubled as guided suggestion. Children were sung into a communal cadence, elders led breath circles intended to align heart rates, and nightly readings directed attention away from individual pain toward a promised collective rest. There were exercises to loosen the grip of memory, small tasks repeated until they dulled the mind's edge, stories told in loops until they felt inevitable, and chores performed silently to condition obedience. Every mechanism had a dual face. It was both pastoral care and social technology, tender language masking an apparatus designed to manufacture consent over long seasons. In a ledger I found notes on rehearsal: pastoral teams practicing cadence in the chapel, the schoolmaster timing exhalations, women in the kitchen whispering the same phrases by rote. The pattern's genius was kindness. The teachers wrapped the proposal in neighborly concern and framed surrender as relief, a communal mercy rather than abandonment. But mercy, even when offered earnestly, can become a tool if wielded by those who imagine themselves stewards of fate rather than servants of people. I traced correspondence between Moser and 2 other elders where they debated ethical limits. They worried that some might resist, and how to lessen resistance without force. One note suggested targeted narratives for those most doubtful: personal stories of reunion, images of fields and soft voices, reminders that the cold world would not be the end. This bureaucratic tenderness extended into the final weeks when the town systematically removed noise. The bell was silenced, clocks were boxed, and names were quietly not spoken. These were not violent acts. They were surgical and banal, small administrative steps that, strung together, altered the town's internal weather until the settling felt like arriving home. I examined minutes showing who agreed to lead and who abstained. The vote was never unanimous, but the majority pushed forward, convinced by doctrine and by long, careful persuasion. The one who remains awake, according to the text, was to be chosen not by casting lots, but by temperament, someone sturdy, someone who could witness without entering the drift. As I read, I felt the doctrine's logic nesting into my own thoughts like a river finding a channel. It explained the methods and rationalized their necessity with language of deliverance. It was chilling because the apparatus called itself charity, and in doing so, made opposition feel cruel, like arguing that a bath should not be taken for the sick. Still, the record showed hesitation, marginal notes where a hand asked about consent, where a scrawl read maybe too far, and later the writer had crossed these doubts out. Those cross-outs whispered that even devoted minds feared what they were building, and that fear had been smoothed away in the final drafts. I continued to record, aware I might become their only voice. Laura's letters kept surfacing like bones under thawing earth, fragments of story recipe and incantation folded into household correspondence and placed in drawers for decades. She wrote of a figure she called the story woman, who visited thresholds and taught children songs that felt older than the town itself. The story woman, she implied, did not speak like a neighbor but like something made of memory. Her voice arrived in dreams and left the waking with a softness. Small clues hinted that Halbrook's rituals grew from older customs imported by the founders. Rituals not malicious in origin, but reshaped by circumstances into a different instrument. An immigrant people carrying a relic of containment could, under pressure, turn that relic into a communal solution for grief and hunger and constant winter scarcity. In one of the journals a woman wrote, "She visited my sleep and braided sorrow into warm threads. Take this as comfort," and I could not tell if she meant baptism or erasure. I spent long hours reading lines that blurred the line between consolation and compulsion, and in that blur the town's story began to look less like simple faith and more like a crafted program. Sometimes the notes were affectionate. Recipes, lullabies, names of herbs. But alongside them were meeting minutes discussing timing, rehearsal, and the careful removal of mechanical disturbance. There was also resistance recorded in small ways. A young father named Amos voiced objections. A baker removed himself from leading exercises, uneasy at the growing insistence. Amos's name recurred in a letter where an elder cautioned peers to handle refusals tenderly and suggested drawing doubters into tasks until their dissent felt ill-fitting. Those tactics were insidious because they were patient, working across seasons until the idea of resistance felt selfish compared to promises of peace for the group. Yet resistance left marks. Lena Thorne's fingernails bore fibers as if she had tried to claw free, and her note ended with a question that read like a ghost, "Who is she?" I found later notes where community leaders debated how to integrate weaker wills, pair them with friends, increase lullaby exposure, subtly alter diets to induce deeper sleep. The more I read, the more a pattern emerged. Tactics not of knives but of repertoire, not of chains but of habit, and affection reshaped into constraint. It is easy to say they chose to die, harder to accept that a community's kindness can become the very net that holds them close as they are led away. At the center of the doctrine lay an old human paradoxy, the desire to end suffering colliding with the power to decide who may go and how they go. I copied signatures and notes, vowed to unweave their language and to speak their names aloud again now. My copies began to unsettle others. The more I revealed, the more paper was misplaced or tucked away in different stacks, and some volumes were slow to return to their shelves. I wrote letters to the county. My formal inquiries received polite replies promising an inquest that never convened, an official hand that folded its pages carefully away. Someone in the capital had read my first dispatch and replied with a line about propriety and expense. The state could not afford to re-examine towns already counted on the census rolls. A sheriff from the next district visited under weathered pretenses, and when he left he seemed relieved, as if a burden had been passed back into my hands. At night I woke with the sense of being noticed, an awareness that I was no longer alone in my witness, that eyes now watched the witness. One evening a neighbor named Harlan delivered bread and warned me to be careful. He had been raised near Halbrook, and he described how people had been coaxed with gifts and small kindnesses. He said, "Don't make a theater of it, Doc. There are things that shut doors when spoken about too loud, and some doors should remain closed for a reason." I thought him afraid on Harlan's account until I found his handwriting in a margin of a ledger, a phrase scratched and subsequently erased, "Better for the quiet." Who policed the silence? It was not only those within town, but circuits of obligation, merchants, relatives, county officials, who found the cost of uproar too dear. In my copied notes I discovered marginalia from an unknown hand that read Janugu, the old German stitched word meaning enough, a command disguised as mercy. That word had been embroidered on the cloth by the clapper, and it translated not simply into cessation, but into a claim of sufficiency. Enough suffering, end now. I feared that an institutional theology had grown teeth by promising relief and convincing others it was mercy to close the book on a town's name. As winter thinned into spring, letters arrived from families elsewhere asking questions about lost kin, their appeals polite at first and then more insistent. Some relatives were told nothing. Others received carefully phrased notes suggesting that their kin had gone to be with the Lord or that they had fallen to a brief fever. Those official letters read like alibis, comforting pronouncements meant to soothe inquiries without opening the ledger's pages to the public light. I travelled to Brookhaven where Mr. Ephraim Bell had kept a local log and found him reluctant to speak. He had written about the Bell's silence, but crossed the entry. He told me he thought the people of Halbrook had been seeking peace, that they had been a quiet sort, and that outsiders might not understand their ways. But his voice trembled when he said it, and a sheen of snow had taken on a hush as he spoke. Some account had been taken of the town, and they had paid a price. I walked on, my pen warm. By the time I reached the 8th week of records, my own nocturnes had taken on the town's rhythm. I found myself waking at odd hours with the taste of cold in my mouth. The murmur returned in dreams, now with syntax, breaths like metronomes, a cadence that felt like instruction more than suggestion. In one dream the woman in the doorway turned, not to face me but to face something beyond, and I woke with the certainty that she saw what I could not see. My notebook filled with sketches of spirals and concentric arcs, the marks identical to those in the town's marginalia, as if some habit had passed from page to page. Sleep became a field where suggestion moved easily, and I began to suspect that repeated rehearsal had tuned the town as one might tune an instrument. The keepers had taught them harmonics of ease, lullaby phrasing, timed exhalations, and rituals that lowered resistance until the final step felt inevitable. I tried to place culpability. Was it a cruel cleric or a tender aggregate of neighbors who believed they were easing pain? The answer felt impossible and too human. Still, patterns suggested coordination beyond kindness, procurement notes for small vials, a ledger of repeated visits by a traveling seamstress who mended curtains, and whispered phrases. When I read these details aloud to the empty chapel one night, the air tightened, and a voice, neither male nor female, seemed to answer back from the bell tower. It said, "You are late," as if the town's absence awaited a tardy witness and judged me for my delay. If this voice has found you as it found me, I ask something of you. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Do this not as spectacle, but as pact. The act is symbolic. It anchors you to the knowledge you now carry and binds your attention in a way that matters to what follows. Some nights I felt the pull toward their method, the seduction of mutual release, a lull in my worry that promised warmth and an end to the ache of bearing witness. But then I would remember Lena's fingers, the dirt under the nails, the small defensive scratches, and the image curdled into caution rather than comfort. There were entries from the schoolmaster noting dreams, given publicly as instruction, children rehearsed into acceptance by narrative and rhyme. In the margins of a prayer book someone had written, not as accusation but as observation, "She does not take us by force, she waits until we choose." That line gnawed at me because it was both true and incomplete. Choosing under shaped conditions is still choice, but what of the shaping agents? I copy their lilies of speech into my notes and feel the pull to join them. My notebook began to read like a ledger of temptation. The lines I copied seemed to hum when I later read them aloud in the cold chapel. I tried to test the doctrine. A breath circle with none of the town present, 6 hours of silence, a small experiment to see if cadence alone could slip a mind. It was foolish. The first experiment ended with a dream of a woman standing at my bedside and the same whisper, "You're late," threaded like accusation. Yet the experiments taught me how small mechanics reshaped attention. 3 evenings of partial light deprivation altered my appetite for noise and memory in subtle ways. Ritual is a slow vector, repeated. It shifts the center of gravity for a single life until the individual orbits the communal center instead of its own. I worried the methodology could be weaponized, and that worry turned to urgent alarm when I discovered travel receipts showing a string of visitors who came to Halbrook under the guise of teaching domestic crafts. They were seamstresses, masons and peddlers who also stayed nights in rooms and left with small sacks labeled in shorthand. The sacks were listed as supplies for settling exercises. How much of the town's interior life had been cultivated by these visits? Were they unwitting conveyors of technique or conscious agents of a wider design? The ledger included names of two men listed only as friends from the city, who had brought with them a set of choral readings and an instrument designed to hold a sustained tone. When I finally found the instrument in a trunk, it looked like a metal drone capable of a low, continuous hum. Notes indicated it had been played nightly under cover of small fires. The hum might have been acoustic suggestion, a reinforcement of cadence that aided the onset of the veil hour. It was simple technology layered with belief. As I catalogued artifacts, I felt the town's practice move from folkloric to engineered, a hybrid of devotion and technique that produced predictable states in those exposed. These findings made the moral terrain messier, a blend of community care, experimental conditioning, and perhaps a deliberate effort by actors who believed in the teleology of unity. My hand shook as I copied receipts and sketched the instrument. The mechanical and the sacred were braided together in a way that resisted tidy explanation. At night, I would sit at Reverend Moses' desk and watch the snow map the valley, thinking of how an idea can be passed hand to hand until it becomes fate. Now, I followed those footprints the day the thaw began in earnest, boots sinking to half their depth, each step memorizing the pattern of departure. They led into the pines where snow closed like a hand and where the air tasted older, as if the forest itself remembered a liturgy. At the edge of a small clearing, I found the stones and a rough ring of sticks someone had tamped into the earth. It matched the sketch in the Reverend's margin. In the center lay a small cloth bundle wrapped in oilskin, and when I opened it, I found a child's doll with one eye missing and a scrap of parchment. The scrap bore a single line written in a careful, childish hand. She told me stories in my sleep, and beneath it a childish drawing of a woman with no face. It was the same line I had seen scattered through pockets and hymnals in town, and the drawing was the same spiral carved into 3 school desks. The clearing had the air of deliberate ordinariness, small household things placed like offerings: a kettle, a scorched hymn book, a wool mitten folded in half. Someone had left these things as if to make the place a domestic altar, a familiar field that softened the leap into whatever lay beyond the trees. I dug deeper into the ground and found the clapper of the chapel bell, wrapped in linen and hidden under a flat stone, its iron dulled by age and careful handling. It was as if pieces of the town had been moved and reassembled in that ring to create a portable chapel, a locus of settlement outside the town's boundaries. I wondered then whether the ritual had ever been meant to be fully communal, or whether smaller circles within the town had experimented with passing first. The cloth bore stitchwork in a Germanic hand, Janugu stitched in deliberate loops, enough the same command as the altar embroidery, a word of ending and sufficiency. This clearing was a seam between town and forest, domesticity and ritual. Whoever had prepared it had wanted an ordinary place to mediate an extraordinary passage. I collected the doll and wrapped it in my coat, feeling absurdly protective of a child's keepsake and ashamed that an object could be more resistant than reason. On the parchment, I made a rubbing of the child's drawing and later compared it with the spiral and found minor variations, as if each hand left its own cadence. Those small differences suggested practice and iteration, not spontaneous choice. This had been rehearsed, perfected, and then implemented like an engineered rite. Back at the chapel, I sketched the clearing and wrote notes in a tight hand, mapping the distances and angles as if charting a secret ritual geography. I sketched the ring and felt the narrativization of place coalesce into culpability, then softly. Mapping Halbrook's ring led me to other places on old maps where similar annotations existed, small circles marked in pencil, names crossed, and dates appended like a ledger of endings. In a county archive, I found a file of small towns that had sent similar parcels to registrars, notes about quiet deaths, children sleeping unusually soundly, bells unstruck for days. The pattern suggested a practice rather than an accident. Correspondence showed clerics in different valleys trading methods, sharing lullabies, and comparing results with clinical precision. Letters between pastors spoke of breath techniques and the ordering of names, and the tone was clinical and proud, as if they counted results like harvest tallies. It was now clear the phenomenon exceeded Halbrook. Something like a network had formed, a ragged fellowship of custodians who believed in an ordered passing. Some argued for secrecy to protect the dignity of the bereaved. Others wrote in confidence about the utility, how unified endings prevented epidemics of grief and social disorder. Reading these lines felt like watching bureaucracy meet belief. Policies were drafted alongside psalms, and ethics became a form of paperwork to be signed and stored. I uncovered a note from a regional bishop thanking Reverend Moser for a thorough report and suggesting a conference to codify practices across parishes. The existence of institutional recommendation surprised me less than it frightened me. A network legitimizing the practice could easily render it normal and replicated elsewhere. I reached out to a historian who specialized in immigrant rituals, and she explained how certain old-world customs could be adapted into technological processes by those seeking pragmatic solutions. She described thresholds in other communities where communal rest had been argued as charity, places where death was reframed as a social good to spare the living further suffering. But adapt and codify are different verbs. When ritual becomes protocol, it acquires administrative momentum, and administrations seldom know how to stop their own procedures. My letters to magistrates asking for investigation were met with bureaucratic silence or a vague promise of review. Power, I learned, can bury questions beneath procedure. I found a ledger with a list of towns and dates, and alongside a faint stamp for internal use only, and beneath that, initials I could not identify. The initials suggested a committee or council that had overseen these transfers of practice, a hidden bureaucracy that treated endings as municipal operations. How many lives have been organized by such committees? The thought felt like counting graves under the snow, an act of arithmetic that numbed more than it clarified. Now, pressure mounted as I tried to publish what I had found. Editors replied with caution, citing libel and the need for corroboration I could not supply without more living witnesses. A man in the county seat suggested I drop the inquiry for my own health. He hinted at defamation suits and at the financial ruin that follows a ruined reputation. Someone left a folded note on my bedroll one morning with only 2 words: "Let sleeping people rest." The phrase might have been kindness or a threat, I could not tell which, and that uncertainty was its own weapon. I began to be careful about how I walked and where I wrote. I hid copies of my notes in the hollow of a tree and in the lining of a coachman's trunk. Even those small measures failed me once. A volume I left in the hollow had been opened and its pages shifted, certain entries gone and replaced with neutral commentary. It felt like an erasure not of bodies but of memory, a quiet censorship practiced by hands that wanted the story to end unspoken. My correspondence with other clergy cooled. Letters returned with polite declination or long pauses that felt deliberate and strategic. A pastor in a neighboring county wrote that such matters were delicate and the public would not understand the intent. Better to keep sacred work within sacred walls. Thus, institutional power protects itself by deflecting public scrutiny with appeals to piety and privacy, and those appeals often succeed in stifling inquiry. But silence does not always protect the innocent. Sometimes it secures the convenient, allowing systems of care to transform into systems of finality without democratic consent. I felt the moral weight of that transformation, like a physical thing pressing at my chest until I could scarcely breathe without feeling guilt for those who had no voice. One evening I met a woman whose name appeared in the ledger. She had not lived in Halbrook, but had married in and had now written to me in secret. Her letter described how she had been drawn into the practice through kindness, neighbors bringing soup, sharing stories, offering the idea like a balm for chronic hardship. She insisted they had believed they were doing good. She begged me to tell the truth in a way that honored their intention even as it exposed harm. Her plea tightened the knotted questions. How to condemn a community for seeking relief when their seeking was shaped by leaders and by limited alternatives. I kept writing still. To understand the mechanism, I attempted something reckless. I would stay awake through the veil hour to see what awaited those who did not sleep. I fortified my window, kept a pot of strong coffee nearby, and hammered the bell of consciousness with every trick I had. Cold water, bright light, counted prayers. The first night of resistance brought the murmur into the room like a tide, and the voice moved through the walls as if the wood itself had become its throat. It whispered not words but a pattern, an ebb and swell that fluttered the edges of my resolve and made my eyelids ache with the promise of release. I found myself drawing spirals again, fingers tracing the same 17 loops I had seen in margins, and my hand wrote without my conscious consent. At 3 in the morning the oil lamp guttered and a shadow moved across the bed, a shape like a woman holding herself together with song. She did not speak directly. Instead, memories arrived in me like borrowed garments, snatches of lullabies, the scent of a mother's shawl, a sense of being finally held. My throat tightened as if I might sob or smile, and I could not tell which reaction belonged to me and which belonged to the impression left by the dream. Each attempt to stay awake altered me. I learned the ritual's components in my body rather than my mind, a dangerous kind of learning that comes without consent. The doctrine of scaffolding was effective circadian nudges, rhythmic sounds, narrative therapy, and social reinforcement. Small repeated acts that recalibrated attentional patterns. As I resisted, physical symptoms appeared. My chest loosened, a pressure behind the eyes, a slow pull at limbs that felt like entry toward other people. I wrote furiously to anchor myself, notes that tried to pin the experience to language as if words could tether soul and keep it from drifting. But words sometimes failed. There were nights when my script stood on the page like a body, and the ink trembled as if in sympathy with the settled town. Neighbors reported similar phenomena. A sewing woman who fell asleep at her wheel while stitching repeated phrases, a blacksmith who dreamed in chorus with his neighbor. The synchrony was the instrument. Coordinated internal states create emergent properties, and in Halbrook's case, produced a collective silence that felt like passage. To observe was to risk being folded into the pattern, and each observation required an unglamorous stubbornness, a refusal to let habit carry me away. I refused to look away. Sometimes I thought she was myth, and sometimes I thought she was method. Increasingly, I suspected she was both, a personification of a process honed by ritual and care. The notion of a maternal figure offering comfort is ancient, and the people of Halbrook folded that archetype neatly into their doctrine until it performed the labor of closure. There is a terrible algebra here. Consolation plus authority plus scarcity equals a high probability of consent to radical solutions. Leaders can convert narratives into policies, and when grief is constant, the policy of ending pain can seem like the most humane alternative. But the transformation from sermon to schedule ought to alarm us, because when administration takes on spiritual functions, the mechanics of power can become invisible. I met a woman whose husband had been included in the ledger. She told me they had been promised reunion, a communal sleeping that would carry them to one another. Her eyes filled with grief and gratitude in the same breath, and I could not tell whether to feel compassion or accusation towards someone whose hope had been engineered. Even the language was cooked to comfort. They called it settling, return, passing together, euphemisms that made the end feel like a domestic chore and not a final act. In my notes, I compared their terms to bureaucratic language, consent forms, signatures, timetables. The vocabulary of care was now the vocabulary of closure. Those who administered the practice insisted on dignity. They vowed to make passing orderly and peaceful. But dignity exists on a spectrum that can mask containment. What is worrisome is the degree of normalization. The more institutions adopt such modes, the less likely a society is to interrogate the moral calculus behind them. I kept tracing threads, letters, minutes, receipts, and noticing that each instance of codification lowered the threshold for replication elsewhere, a contagious rationality of quiet endings. Behind closed doors, committees formed agendas, and agendas became practice. The velocity of institutional habit does not require malice, only utility and a sense of efficiency. At the same time, I found examples of true tenderness, neighbors who gentled the dying, families who found solace in shared ritual and believed it spared their kin from years of toil. The duality defied simple moralism, what to do with a method that offered both solace and erasure. The question haunted every clerk and magistrate I wrote to. Now, in quiet moments, I traced the practice back through the immigrant lines to rituals that predated the parish. a set of threshold customs meant to bind kin across harsh seasons. Those customs, benign in origin, served to comfort and to conserve. In a new land of scarcity, they were repurposed into a radical solution for communal endurance. But repurposing dissolves nuance. What once soothed a child's cold could become an instrument to channel suffering out of the living community. I found references to similar practices in old ethnographies where groups used synchronized rest to conserve resources during famine, but those were adaptive measures, not institutional programs. Holbrook's version read like an organizational upgrade, the warmth of old custom paired with lists, timetables, and a vocabulary of consent that looked like paperwork. I came to believe that the story woman, she, was less a singular being than a cultural vector, a figure that carried older rituals into new administrative frameworks. Framing her as a person was easier than admitting the more insidious truth. Communities can collectively manufacture an entity to legitimize what they need to do. When such an entity is named, dressed in lullabies and neighborly language, it can perform authority without a single pronounced command. It becomes a motherless mother. This structural humility, anonymity married to ritual, made the work of persuasion efficient and less accountable. No single villain, only a system of care repurposed into a mechanism. I returned repeatedly to Lena and to her defensive marks. She was the thread that refused the pattern and the evidence that not everyone succumbed without friction. I mapped cases where resistance had been managed rather than honored: minor social punishments, exclusion from certain rituals, and increased exposure to lullaby work for the doubtful. These tactics were subtle and slow, easily defensible as pastoral care, yet in aggregate they tended toward the same final geometry of communal exit. Behind the fold of old customs was a bureaucracy that learned to love its own instruments, a network that standardized endings and then hid behind sanctity. As I prepared to publish, men in the capital sent a gentle note suggesting restraint, reminding me that social cohesion sometimes depends on shared narratives left unchallenged. The note framed my work as a potential source of community destabilization and pleaded for prudence. Again, a bureaucratic rearguard using language of peace to stop inquiry. I chose to publish with care and with a witness. The article I assembled was careful, annotated, footnoted, and yet when it left my hands, the first wave of reaction was not the moral debate I expected, but bureaucratic stonewalling. Editors pressed me for shorter lines, for fewer ambiguities. They wanted a story that fit tidy columns and stark judgments, not the messy honesty I had written. Before long, I began to hear rumor that pieces of my evidence had vanished from the local archive. Pages mislaid, journals returned with entries smudged or removed. A man called anonymously to my inn in the late hour. He advised me to stop my digging for the sake of my family and spoke of consequences that were not only reputational. Threats began as hints and then sharpened into references to ruined careers, locked doors, and the quiet inconvenience of being forgotten by those with influence. Those with power do not always lift a fist. Sometimes they recalibrate institutions so that questions fade and files close with courteous signatures. I felt encircled on all sides: social pressure, bureaucratic inertia, and the seductive logic the doctrine offered to those who had once believed it was mercy. The moral core of the question had been absorbed into institutions that wished not to be held accountable, and the machinery of public life deferred to the soothing language of caretaking. Despite that, a small cohort of townspeople and a few journalists pressed on, publishing partial accounts and letters that spoke of lullabies and hidden ledgers. The partial accounts created a new danger: sensationalism. Those who wanted outrage found it easy to reduce nuance to villains and saints, and the core questions blurred. One afternoon, a woman whose signature I had copied threatened legal action, claiming her consent was misrepresented. Her lawyer sent a polite but menacing letter asking for retraction. Legal threats and public fury moved like weather, and I learned that truth can be assaulted not only by lies, but by formal systems that make telling costly. I was taken to court to testify about my methods. My notes subpoenaed and my private correspondence opened in public hearings. The theater of inquiry began to unravel the witness. In court they parsed my language, questioned my motives, and suggested that my presence in Holbrook may have altered the evidence by introducing modern anxieties into a closed community. The suggestion stung because it bore a sliver of truth. I was an intruder, and my intrusion had effects. But intrusion did not absolve the governance that had planned the settling. My testimony was precise but humanly exhausted. While I offered careful readings of documents, some jurors preferred the comfort of a simple villain to the discomfort of systemic culpability. I had spoken truth, yet systems of power turned speech into compliance. After the court's quiet settlement, I believed my task done until a winter later when I found my own notes shifting in tone, as if resonance had crept from the page into my bones. I woke some nights with the sweet impression of another's hand smoothing my brow, and for an instant the world seemed narrow and warm rather than vast and aching. Those moments terrified me because they tasted like the relief the town had sought, the same lull of being folded into a broader presence, where loneliness thinned. I could not be sure whether these were aftereffects of too many late nights or a real sympathetic echo created by the artifacts I had catalogued and rehearsed in my head. Once, I dreamed of standing at the edge of the clearing as a chorus rose, and the spirals I had drawn swelled into living pathways beneath footfalls. The dream ended with the perception, not of loss, but of joining, and I woke with tears on my face that felt like a farewell and a greeting at once. While human beings can create such sensations with music and synchronized movement, the ethics hinge on consent and the structural conditions that produce it. I had catalogued methods, machines and minutes, but I had not yet fully accounted for the emotional logic that made the offering of unity appealing. People who suffer chronic want do not think as philosophers in the moment of receiving solace. They feel only the immediate warm reprieve and the promise that pain will stop. That human hunger explained why the practice spread, not why it was right, and the difference matters because rights are the scaffolding that protect those most vulnerable. In the margins of a report I found a sentence that stayed with me without anchors. Unity dissolves into erasure, and the record collapses into myth. Anchors, the doctrine insisted, were necessary to hold an otherwise untraceable transition in a shared world. But anchors also became mechanisms of control when chosen by authority. I thought then of the small measures that built the apparatus: lullabies, scheduled breathing, the silencing of clocks, simple things that reorganize attention toward the same desired state. The moral calculus became personal. To speak of systems was to name people who were at once tender and terrifying, neighbors who loved and leaders who planned. In some nights of weakness I felt the pull to rest, to let the murmur carry me, and that temptation taught me how seductive relief can be when iterated by community. But desire does not justify design. The question remains who may build such designs and under what democratic scrutiny they should be placed. I resolved to keep telling their names until the quiet could not. With time I shifted from investigation to preservation. I gathered names and objects and organized them into a small archive meant to resist the slow erasures I had witnessed. The archive was humble: a trunk with papers, a chest of hymnals, the child's doll from the clearing, and lists of names with times and signatures. An ugly and tender testament. I opened the archive to a few trusted scholars and a local minister who had begun to regret the work of the past and who wanted to remember with honesty. They debated how to present the materials. Should the story be framed as a tragedy, a mutual mercy gone too far, or an institutional failure hiding behind kindness? The debates were fractious because memory is contested and because those who lived through it demanded different versions of truth: explanation, absolution, or condemnation. I proposed a public reading of names, a ritual of remembrance that respected both grief and accountability. A communal act that would name each person and refuse the erasure. The first reading was small: a dozen people clustered in the chapel with candles and our breath visible in the cold, each name spoken in a careful cadence. As we read, the spiral motif, once anonymous, became a symbol of attention rather than an instrument of closure. We tried to reclaim their pattern for witness, not for erasure. Neighbors who had once defended the doctrine stood in the back and wept, not all from guilt but from a slow dawning that their earlier certainties had been complicated. Others left the chapel and avoided me afterwards. Reconciliation had limits, and some families preferred silence to the messy light of public naming. The effort to memorialize ran into institutional resistance. Nevertheless, a local council argued that such readings risked reopening old wounds and recommended a closed plaque instead. I refused the closed plaque because closure that prevents questions is itself a form of control, and memorials must not act as gagging devices for uneasy truths. Small victories followed. A modest plaque was installed, but accompanied by an accessible archive, and a rotating committee of scholars and laypeople was tasked with stewardship. Beyond Halbrook, the archive became a cautionary tale. Scholars wrote papers, journalists covered the ritual in other towns, and a slow cultural conversation began about collective endings. That conversation mattered because it exposed the slippery slope from care to engineering, and made people ask whether institutions had the right to design endings without full public debate. I worked to convene councils and panels to craft consent processes that could never be rushed or hidden. Inevitably, the story took a toll. Friends who once welcomed my questions avoided my presence, and the sound of my name in some rooms tightened conversations into awkward silence. There were nights when even my own reflection in the window looked like a stranger, a man who had watched too long and carried other people's rest inside him. I learned the hard lesson that bearing witness is not neutral labor. It reshapes the witness, sometimes into an anchor and sometimes into a vessel for the absent. In quieter moments, I would walk to the cemetery where a modest row of markers had been set in Halbrook's snow, and I would speak each name aloud. Speaking the names felt like unpicking the stitch that held the town's hush together. Each syllable was a small, deliberate undoing of the machinery that had worked so long. Those readings were imperfect. Some refused to attend, and some believed silence was itself a memorial. But the act of naming resisted the slow curation of forgetfulness. After many such readings, a young scholar contacted me with a proposal for a public inquiry and local oversight protocols. The proposal felt like a thin scaffold, but was better than silence. We drafted guidelines, clear procedures for any communal ritual that proposed shared endings, requirements for independent oversight, and legally binding consent protocols renewed across time. Policy alone could not repair grief, but it could place guardrails around practices and create forums for debate rather than leaving decisions to small committees in closed rooms. Even with measures in place, the emotional work remained. Conversations with grandchildren of those who had been settled, visits to homes where the old lullaby still hummed under breath. At one such visit, an elderly woman took my hand and said, "We were not thinking that far ahead. We were only trying to keep a child warm." Her voice carried a lifetime of winter. Her confession was a humanizing moment that refused moral flatness, and it reminded me that judgment without context is a blunt instrument that can harm as much as heal. So I insisted the archives be open, that the doll and the clapper and the hymnals be available to anyone who wished to study them, and that oral histories be recorded. To preserve dignity, the records would include dissent as well as devotion marginalia, crossed outs, and children's drawings alongside official minutes and signatures. That inclusive record was a small rebellion against erasure. It honored resistance and allowed future citizens to see how a set of practices took shape over time. I taught meetings on consent and institutional ethics and saw with modest joy that some small shift occurred in neighboring towns. Longer debates before implementing communal policies. People began to ask difficult questions about the limits of pastoral care and the necessary transparency of institutions that stewarded communal life. Now, I end this account not because answers are finished, but because the act of telling is itself a form of witness with its own fragile limits. You have listened as I have walked the clearing and read the margins, and watched the bells clapper lie like a talisman on the altar. This is not a tale that resolves into simple justice or simple villainy. It is a knot of sorrow, method, and human yearning that resists a single moral tidy conclusion. If there is a lesson, it is this: when communities craft practices to alleviate suffering, they must do so in the sight of one another under rules that are public and revisable. Private councils and folded minutes cannot substitute for open deliberation, and the language of care must never be allowed to smuggle in absolute power. Systems that standardize exits must be subject to scrutiny at every stage. Consent must be informed, ongoing, and revisitable, and oversight must be independent and transparent. We must demand mechanisms that prevent the conversion of neighborly kindness into machinery, and we must build institutions that err on preserving possibility rather than curating finality, to protect the vulnerable, to honor resistance, and to ensure that choices are not engineered by cumulative kindnesses. Law and public ethics must walk with communal practices. I say this not as a jurist, but as someone who has seen how small rituals become large systems and how large systems can mask harm with gentle language. The memory of Holbrook should not be a footnote to an old tragedy, but a prompt for perpetual vigilance, a call to watch how we name mercy and how we distribute it. Let the child's dole and the clapper be kept not under glass as trophies, but as tools for teaching. Lessons in how communities can go wrong when decisions are hidden. Go to the records if you can. Read the marginalia, the struck-out doubts, the lullabies bowed into routines. Those are the places where intention and practice meet and mend. If you are a leader of any small congregation or civic body, ask yourself how your institution could be repurposed and who might be most at risk if it were. If you are someone who seeks to help your neighbor, remember that help must enlarge autonomy, not replace it. Kindness without consent becomes the very cage it tries to spare. This is not a repudiation of pastoral care, but an insistence that care and power be checked by transparency, and that death, above all, not be administered in private. History will keep offering variants of the same temptation: the efficient closure, the tranquil end, the mutual resting. Our task is to say no to hidden procedures and yes to open deliberation. I am not a prophet, and I do not presume to fix every wrong. I offer this story as a tool, a slow, unwieldy instrument that readers must sharpen and temper. Take this tale into your town halls and into your quiet rooms. Let it be a test of your democracy and empathy, and let it make you ask the uncomfortable questions. Above all, watch the clocks you keep. Notice how voices lull you, and speak the names you learn out loud. Naming is a kind of rescue against erasure. If you carry nothing else from Holbrook, carry this: silence can be kindness, but it can also be a cultivated state. Vigilance is the price of saving one another. Keep watch, name them aloud.